So we just started recording. So I'll say welcome again, and thank you all for joining. My name is Mike Talbot. I'm the director of the Mexico Global Center in Mexico City. We want to give a thank you to all of those that are supporting this Global Dialogue series, specifically Notre Dame International, the Office of the President, the Notre Dame Alumni Association, and the various colleges, schools, and units on campus. Their contribution to it has really marked and demonstrated the university's commitment to being a leader in the discussion about pressing global needs of humanity. This week, I'm very excited to be with you and for us to have the opportunity to discuss the water crisis in Mexico City, as well as its impact on the nearly 22 million people living in the metropolitan area. Not everyone knows that Mexico City has been facing a water crisis for some time now. It's not a drought as you might normally think of it. We received plenty of rain during the rainy season, but not enough is being captured to meet the needs of the growing city. Aquifers are not replenished at the required levels, and the water that is captured is often lost before it can reach the customer. It's a fairly common challenge for megacities around the world, namely maintaining infrastructure at the level needed to keep up with a very fast growing population. This challenge is further exacerbated by the fact that many residents refuse to pay their water bill because of the frequent outages. And frankly, who can blame them? They often have to pay for water from private companies to meet their needs. But that means that authorities receive less revenue to invest in updating water systems, both in order to make them more efficient and to capture more water. It's a downward spiral of reduced services leading to reduced investment and vice versa. As we see in the videos, or as we saw in the videos that were posted online, Professor Alejandro Estefan is currently working with the government of Mexico City on the economics of this challenge, and he has presented those in the videos that we saw, as well as strategies for how to increase revenue that can be used to update water infrastructure. So just a few logistical things before we jump in. Number one, if you have any questions, and we invite any questions you might have for Professor Estefan, please use the chat function at the bottom of the screen. Doing so will allow us to facilitate the questions as effectively as possible, and we will try to answer as many as we can in the time permitting. Secondly, as many of you know, when we promoted this event, we shared a few pre-recorded videos that were posted on the ThinkND website, where Professor Estefan discussed a few themes related to water infrastructure and revenue. For those of you who have not had a chance to watch them yet, I highly recommend you do that immediately after this session. I think you'll find them very informative and very interesting. So now to introduce our speaker for today, Alejandro Estefan is an assistant professor of development economics at Notre Dame's Keough School of Global Affairs. His research seeks to understand the causes of and hindrances to economic development, and he tries to use this knowledge to inform policy decisions. His work covers a wide range of topics in the field of development economics, including the factors that contribute to lifting individuals out of poverty, the effects of public investment in schools, female labor force participation and its consequences, and state capacity and tax revenue collection. I'd also like to note that he's a native of Mexico City, although his work is really global and he looks at development policy internationally. We're very happy to have several projects between our office here and Professor Estefan, and excited to engage him both today and throughout the year. So I'd like to welcome my colleague and friend, Alejandro Estefan from the Keough School of Global Affairs to talk to us today about the water crisis in Mexico City. Professor Estefan, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you so much, Mike. You're very generous with your introduction. I don't think I can live up to it, but thank you so much. Thank you so much. I'm delighted to be here with you.
Great. Let's jump right in. And before we talk about the financing of infrastructure maintenance and water infrastructure in Mexico City, perhaps you could share some of the sources of the water crisis in Mexico City. Is this purely an issue of infrastructure and disrepair, or are there other factors that have contributed to the fact that there's not always reliable, safe drinking water?
Thank you, Mike. Well, as you mentioned, the sources of the problem are many. I can mention a few of them here. To start with, water treatment is costly. In particular, electric energy represents about 70 to 75% of the operation costs of public entities that treat running water. And even though the federal government subsidizes electricity, its costs exert tremendous pressure on local public finance. So local governments face this pressure to pay for electric energy. That's the first problem. A second problem is, as you mentioned earlier, that Mexico City urban area is expanding. And so that places pressure on the aquifer of the city. Aquifers, for those of you who do not know, are these underground layers of water-bearing permeable rock. And they are important because they are a key source of water supply. When urban settlements grow, what this does is it increases water consumption first, and second, it expands the amount of pavement in the city. And so that prevents aquifers from recharging. Furthermore, economic activities and usage that customers give to water lower water quality. And so the expansion of urban settlements makes the extraction of running water costlier for the government, because it's more expensive to get the same amount of water, and second, it's more expensive to get the water of the same quality or good quality water. A third problem is that some economic activities performed by customers are particularly demanding. To give you two examples, the first of them is agriculture. Even though Mexico City has a population of 22 million inhabitants, some municipalities in the southern part of the city continue to rely on agriculture as an economic activity. And so this activity in particular increases the demand for water, and it also pollutes the aquifer through the use of fertilizers and other chemical compounds. This in turn increases the cost of provision of treatment of water. And something similar occurs with industry. Another problem relates more directly to residential customers. And this is the problem of waste. The National Autonomous University of Mexico estimates that about 40% of the water supply of the city is actually wasted by customers. And the problem is compounded by the fact that only 61% of the residential users have water meters. Thus, it is very hard for the government to measure water usage and charge customers accordingly. The last problem I like to highlight is that the cost of provision is particularly high for areas of the city with high population density. The cost of introducing hydraulic infrastructure in these parts of the city is extremely high, and therefore water access is a problem for these relatively dense parts of the city, but also low-income municipalities. And so overall, all of these problems, what they do is they lead to a deficit in the flow of water that reaches urban settlements relative to the demand placed by residential customers and by businesses alike.
So I'm struck by the fact that many of us living in Mexico City don't face this problem, that it is localized in some ways. You mentioned that particularly dense areas, poor and marginalized communities struggle with access to water in a way that other parts of the cities, more affluent parts of the cities perhaps, do not. To what extent is awareness of this challenge an issue? Is it a barrier to addressing it?
Well, I think this is an excellent question. And I'd say here that awareness is a problem for two reasons. At least from a public finance perspective, it's a problem for two reasons. The first of them is waste. A lack of awareness leads customers to waste water. As I said before, 40% of the water supply of the city is wasted by customers. And water waste, what it does is it worsens the water flow deficit, and it indirectly affects the areas that have high costs of water provision and these other vulnerable populations. And so what happens is unaware customers, they waste water, and by doing so, they indirectly affect other people living in vulnerable areas that face water disruptions frequently. Furthermore, since the cost of water provision is subsidized, waste becomes even worse from a financial perspective. And so it's not only that waste indirectly affects people living in vulnerable areas, it's also that waste increases the financial pressure for the government to provide water to all areas of the city. A second reason why unawareness is a problem is taxpayers oftentimes refuse to pay their utility bills. And so when taxpayers aren't aware of the quality or the effort that the government places in providing public services, they are less likely to pay their utility bills. As you may know, about 40% of the taxpayers in the city are delinquent, meaning that about 1 in 2 people do not pay their tax bills. And so this is precisely the reason why in our latest research project, we analyze the determinants of taxpayer tax morale. What we want to know is whether improving the perception of taxpayers about the issues that the city faces and the quality of the public services that the government provides increases their probability of payment. And so to summarize, awareness is an important issue for two reasons. The first of them is that without awareness, people waste water, and that affects everyone else in the city. And the second reason is unawareness leads to reduced payment. And so we want to use policy by raising awareness of customers, informing them on the potential consequences of their actions. And we want to see whether doing this increases payment and revenues for the government.
That's probably a good place to ask you to share a little bit more about the treatment that you talked about in your video, right? With the sanctions versus kind of public good language in these letters that were sent out. How do you think, I mean, we've seen the data on it, but how do you think that influenced people's responses? What is kind of the more effective strategy based on what you've seen? I understand it might be preliminary, but.
So what we do here, thank you, Mike. What we do here is we submit 100,000 enforcement letters to delinquent taxpayers, and we submit them at random. We divide delinquent taxpayers into different groups. Each group receives a different letter. The first type of letter is a letter that emphasizes the potential legal sanctions that delinquent taxpayers face if they continue to not pay their tax bills. And the second letter has a public goods content. Namely, it emphasizes the importance of tax revenues for the provision of public goods like water, education, healthcare, and so on. And so what we do is, together with the government, we submit these letters. And what we see is that payment increases by approximately 10 percentage points for the group of taxpayers that receive the letter emphasizing the potential legal consequences of non-payment. And we see that, in contrast, the letter that emphasizes the public goods motive increases payment, but only by 5 percentage points. And so in this respect, definitely enforcement plays an important role. It's important for the government to invest in enforcement capacity to increase tax revenues. But it's also important for the government to emphasize the public goods aspect of tax payment. In economic jargon, this is called tax morale. And this is the idea that taxpayers perceive the benefits that the government gives them through their tax payments, and so their decision of paying or not paying depends on their perception of the benefits they receive. And so we find evidence for both. We find a case for both the enhanced enforcement measures and the implementation of campaigns that emphasize these public goods provided by the government.
And if I recall from our previous conversations, this is a project that you've been engaging some Notre Dame undergraduate students on to help compile and kind of analyze some of the empirical data. Could you maybe share with us some of what that process is like? I don't know if Luis is here. Maybe he could share some of his experience as well.
Yeah, definitely. So I went into this project last May, not really knowing how to code at all, and much less how to code in languages such as Stata. That is the main language that we use for data processing and for running our regressions and for merging the data sets. And, you know, as they commonly said, you learn on the job. That's pretty much what I did, and what Professor Estefan taught me how to use like this program, so I can get all the databases by myself, merge them by myself, and then from there try to get all of the nice data that is going to be useful for us to make that readily available, to make the regressions, to make the graphs that all are currently supporting our thesis that there are things that the government can control and can do to readily increase tax morale among the population of Mexico City and broader Mexico. So it's been a fantastic journey these past few months. I've learned a lot, and I'm really excited for the continuation of this project, and I can't wait for the results to come out and make them official.
It's wonderful. It's always great to see Notre Dame students being engaged in the important work, both research and policy relevant work that our faculty is doing. So I'm really glad that, Luis, you've gotten that opportunity, and thank you, Alejandro, for including our students in this work. I'm going to ask what might be a very naive question, right? There are multiple types of taxes, multiple sources of revenue for governments. It's not just about taxes on utilities, but it's also payroll taxes, property taxes, in some cases, hotel and tourism taxes. Why can't we shift some of those sources of revenue to improve water infrastructure and infrastructure in general? Why are we thinking about this in terms of we have to increase the pot rather than moving some priorities, some resources from one priority to another?
Thank you, Mike. I think, just to put things in perspective, other than local tax revenues, which include property tax revenues, sales tax revenues and utility bills, local governments also have access to two other sources of revenues. The first of them are these federal transfers earmarked for specific purposes. In particular, some of these transfers are earmarked for the provision of infrastructure. This includes, of course, water infrastructure or hydraulic infrastructure. Some others are devoted to education and or healthcare provision. And so indeed, some of the resources that local governments have access to can be used for the purpose of improving hydraulic infrastructure. Now, one issue with this source of revenue is that because it's a federal transfer, to some extent, its distribution by the federal government is a zero-sum game, meaning local governments cannot always rely on these or on the steady flow of these resources because they are competing with other states and other municipalities for them. And so even though they can use them to make large investments, like building a treatment plant or introducing new pipes in a particular section of a city, they cannot always use this source of tax revenues for more, if you wish, more mundane purposes, which include upgrading infrastructure at the individual level or installing water meters and so on and so forth. So the problem that local governments face is actually a problem of self-reliance as well. They need to be able to levy a sufficiently large tax revenues for them to provide consistently high quality water service. The other source of revenues that governments have access to are fines and fees. So the extent to which police officers can fine people for violating transit norms and so on, to that extent, they can also gather resources that will help them finance water provision. Overall, however, you can think about this as a twofold problem. Local governments need to fund their yearly or day-to-day activities using their own tax revenues. And then on the other hand, they have to partner up with the federal government to make large investments in water infrastructure. So I guess that the problem, my answer to your question is, in a nutshell, we're helping the government with the first of these problems, namely the problem of increasing their self-reliance.
I mean, not to belabor the point, but there's also an ethical question to it, right? I mean, it's not just about revenue, self-reliance versus external, but also what is the responsibility of the government to provide basic services and utilities, particularly to the most vulnerable, those who can't. And so it's an obligation, we could say, of the government, either at the city or the national level, whichever, I'm speaking in kind of abstract terms here, to provide that. But it seems in this instance that it's very much in tension with the resources that are available, whether that be revenue or otherwise. Is there a way that we can reconcile that tension and that conflict between the ethical obligations or the theoretical obligations of providing services to citizens versus the very practical need to have sufficient revenue to do that?
I think this is an interesting question. In fact, a recent study in Nairobi analyzed the impact of interrupting water flow for delinquent taxpayers until they cover their outstanding bill amounts. The study finds that the likelihood of payment increases with interruption of service. And it finds also that relative to other interventions that emphasize tax morale, disrupting service is way more effective in inducing payment. Now, this study was applauded by some economists, but in other disciplines, as you may imagine, the study was scorned in the literature, precisely for the ethical reasons you allude to. Namely, there is an ethical dilemma in the notion of conditioning access to water based on taxpayer behavior. So the state has these obligation of providing access to water to its citizens, while at the same time it has to fund water provision. And the only way that the government can fund water provision in the long run is by increasing tax revenues. Now, this said, naturally, most would agree that the price of accessing sufficient water to cover basic human needs should be very low. In contrast, the price of accessing relatively large amounts of water should be relatively high. Furthermore, one may also agree that high-income taxpayers should pay more for water than low-income taxpayers. And so in general, you can think of the tax function to be a function of the amount of water that the customers use and their income. And so this would be the ideal way of taxing water. In developing countries, though, there are two problems that make this type of taxation difficult. The first of them is that measuring taxpayer income is really difficult. This is because there's high levels of informality in developing countries. So it's very hard for the government to actually measure the income that taxpayers have. The second problem is that measuring water usage is actually problematic. As I mentioned before, only about 60% of residential customers have a water meter. This implies that the government has no way of measuring the water consumption of about 40% of the population. And so with these things in mind, in a developing country setting, perhaps the most immediate policy measure would be to install water meters across all residential properties so that the government can get a more precise estimate of water usage and then tax usage accordingly. A second policy measure that's perhaps a long-term measure is to measure income accurately. And so this is, of course, challenging from a development perspective because governments would have to improve their enforcement of labor regulation and increase their enforcement of financial regulation as well. One way through which governments can reduce the tax burden, however, for vulnerable populations is by creating discount programs, say for the elderly or the individuals that have a pension. And so while the government cannot actually measure income, what it can do is it can reduce tax liabilities for specific population groups based on their demographic characteristics like age or gender and so on.
So you, in your first part of your response to that, the question, your comments about metering connect really closely, I think, with one of the questions that we've received from the audience. And I'll just pause to invite people to submit questions via the chat at the bottom of your screen. But given that connection to metering, I wanted to jump ahead to this question. We can return to some that I have for you, but I think this is a good opportunity and segue. Specifically, they're asking, it seems like metering would be a relatively low cost and effective measure to at least manage usage and to provide an economic tool that enabled us to prioritize certain needs, right? Because we simply know how much people are using it. So for example, they could allow us to prioritize drinking water over agricultural water or industrial usage, or the other options of which people might use water. Could you expand on the possibilities of metering and maybe some of the challenges it would present as well?
Right. This is, I guess, this is an excellent question, and so the answer is it's complex. The problem, I guess, the main problem is that the areas of the city where metering is not in place are also areas with high density of population and irregular urban settlements. And so these are places where other public services are not provided. And so the government, the government cannot just buy meters, put them in the water take of the customer, because there's not such a thing that doesn't exist in irregular settlements. And so what governments need to do is regularize these settlements and provide a series of or a set of different public services other than water, including electricity, roads, and so on and so forth. And doing so is, of course, costly. And so the main reason why this hasn't been done before is because it's very costly to implement. And so the problem is that cities like Mexico have been growing in a disorderly fashion, so much so that some settlements don't even have the basic public goods. And so I agree with the audience that this would potentially be the best possible way of managing water usage, but it's made difficult by the disorganized urban growth of the city.
Thank you for that. Thank you for that answer. That makes a lot of sense. That it's more challenging than we might initially think. I think it's worth stepping back for a minute to recognize the importance of water. I mean, this ongoing series is about water in many different ways and the effects of climate change. And of course, it's easy for us to dive deep into kind of water provision and infrastructure and tax revenue. But could you maybe help us think a little bit about what the implications of having irregular access to water looks like? I've heard instances of people staying at home so that they're on when the water does come or when the truck arrives, or of course there's sanitation and public health implications as well. Can you think about or share with us some of the, I want to say ripple effects without making a terrible pun, I apologize for that, some of the knock-on effects of limited access to water that have implications for economic development, public health, education, etc.?
I think this is an excellent question. I love this question. We haven't done any work looking at this particular issue in Mexico City, and hearing your question actually makes me want to do that. However, there's extensive literature. There's extensive evidence in the literature that households in urban settings that face water disruptions allocate time to collection of water and domestic chores more so than other households. And so it has been reported in the literature that these time spent in household chores and collection of water comes at the cost of other activities, right? So at the expense of other activities. And it has been shown that in particular, work productivity falls when there is no reliable water access for customers. And so a short way of answering your question is that indeed, water disruptions have the main consequence of affecting time allocation for customers. A second part of the answer to that question is water access has been linked to reductions in infectious diseases in many different settings. And so households and locations without reliable access to water also faced increased burden of infectious diseases. And so to summarize, there are two potential consequences of disruptions in water service. The first of them is households need to change the way they use their time, and that makes them less productive. They can work less hours. And the second part is households without reliable access to water are also more likely to face infectious diseases.
You mentioned that this is something that's known in the literature. I mean, am I correct in my assumption that this is not a problem that's unique to Mexico City, right? That there are many other megacities and urban scenarios in which this is a very real and dire problem.
Of course, most of the evidence that I'm talking about is from African countries. In fact, the study that I mentioned before on the impacts of water disruption on payment is from Nairobi, a city in Africa. And so there's many cities in Africa and Latin America alike that face these problems. So this is by no means a problem exclusive to Mexico City. There are many large cities in other parts of the world in developing country contexts that face the problem of water disruptions.
So you mentioned previously, and I've been meaning to return to it for a while now, the topic of subsidies. So when people receive subsidies for their utilities, for their water, electricity, et cetera, it of course reduces the city's or the government's revenue as well, tax revenue, because they're subsidizing the service. How does that play into this? I mean, there's a history of subsidies for multiple utilities in Mexico City. I suppose it's the other side of the tax revenue coin, but how does that play into providing service for certain poorer communities? How does that affect the government's ability to raise sufficient revenue? Yeah, I mean, essentially, how are subsidies relevant here?
I think this question is relevant from an economics perspective. Since excessive water consumption exerts a negative externality on other taxpayers, you may recall my comment about consumption in areas of high income disrupting service in other sections of the city. Classical economic theory then would prescribe a Pigouvian tax to help taxpayers internalize the cost of their actions on others. And so providing service subsidies is actually exactly the opposite of a Pigouvian tax. Because what the subsidy does is it incentivizes people to use water and waste water. And so from an economic perspective, it doesn't really make much sense to subsidize water usage in any way. Now, the only reason why, from a policy perspective, you may advocate for subsidies is if we think that some taxpayers face specific forms of financial hardship, which would then lead them to become delinquent. And so a way of reducing delinquency is by providing these discounts or subsidies that allow taxpayers to make small payments. Even if they cannot pay the whole cost of water, they can at least pay minimal amounts. Now, in developing countries, this is of course not a minor consideration. that said, the case for giving indiscriminate subsidies, as it happens in Mexico City and other developing cities, is very slim. It is very likely to lead to inefficient outcomes. A potential solution would be to target subsidies to households that actually face financial hardship. Now, as I mentioned before, because governments in developing countries cannot actually measure water consumption accurately or income accurately, it becomes difficult to target these subsidies. And one way of doing so, as I mentioned before, is by looking at the specific demographic groups that are more likely to be in financial hardship. Perhaps you may want to, perhaps a government may want to subsidize areas of high density where income is lower, or areas where the age of the population is higher. And so some subsidy programs in Mexico City actually provide reductions in utility bills for individuals aged 65 and higher than that. And so the way these subsidy programs work is by the taxpayer goes to the tax office, provides sufficient documentation to show that she's older than 65, and then she gets the discount. And so this seems like a more reasonable policy to provide these subsidies for people that face financial hardship. Overall, there's no case for providing a generalized subsidy from an economics perspective, though.
I'm gonna turn to the questions from the audience in one minute, but I do have a follow-up from this response. So when people receive subsidies or even discounts or anything like that, I'm curious, in your data, and I know you've applied to treatments in terms of enforcement letters, is there any indication that people who are delinquent in payment for a smaller amount are more likely to pay it? So do we reach a point where we say, well, there's no way I'm going to pay this back, I'll just ignore it? Whereas they might say, this is okay, I can pay a little bit and be back in the green or in the black, as it were.
So what we observe in the data is the government sometimes gives amnesties to taxpayers. And the way these amnesties work is every year in July, the government announces that it will forgive interests and fees and additional payments that taxpayers incur in by not paying their taxes early. And so when this happens, what we observe is an increase in payment for both taxpayers that owe small amounts and taxpayers that owe large amounts. And so the way you may want to think about this is that when debts start piling up, it's harder to pay them, right? And so that one way of increasing revenues for the government is by allowing the forgiveness of these additional charges. And so we do observe that taxpayers that owe large amounts and smaller amounts are more likely to comply when there's a forgiveness in the amounts that they have to pay, right? So yeah, the answer to your question is yes, of course.
That makes sense. Okay, so some questions from the audience in our final 15 minutes or so. One asks, given the difficulties of measuring water usage, are there also problems of maintaining water quality for human consumption? Obviously, we've been talking a lot about just accessing water, but also the quality of that water is an important component as well.
Right, so in this respect, the main issue is the use of electricity. So the government has, the local governments, not only the government of Mexico City, but local governments worldwide, the main way that they have of improving water quality is by building water treatment plants, and these water treatment plants use electricity, tons of it. To the extent to which electricity costs are high, to that extent also water quality is low. And so one particular problem from a public finance perspective is how to pay for electricity, given that tax revenues are low. And so don't get me wrong, the government knows how much water is used in the city, right? So say the government knows the overall amount of water used in the city. What they don't know is who uses that water, right? So they don't know who to charge with water consumption. And so it's a problem to pay for all of this electricity if there's nobody to charge that electricity to. And so, of course, when water payments are reduced, there's also a reduction in water quality through electricity. So if the government cannot pay all the electricity it needs to treat water, then water quality falls.
Our next question, and this might be a good one to kind of wrap up our conversation on, is an excellent question to you as a development economist. Very broad though, how does Mexico intend to address the UN Sustainable Development Goals? And perhaps in light of this conversation, to think specifically about Goal 6 around water and sanitation. What are the kind of strategies that the Mexican government, both local government and federal, can employ to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals?
Well, I think I cannot speak for the government of Mexico. I think I can only provide advice to the government on ways to increase revenues through tax administration measures. I will say though that the government is actually interested in reaching these goals. So even though I cannot point to specific measures, I can say from anecdotal experience that they are actually interested in meeting these goals. This question again is a question I think that one needs to ask to the appropriate authorities. I cannot speak for the government.
That's fair. That's fair. We do have a little more time, so let's squeeze in one more question. How about that? In terms of water quality, is there a regional program to protect water supply sources, both aquifers and surface sources? Related to this issue, it would seem a regional organization would be more effective in dealing with many of these water issues rather than individual communities.
So there's both. I think this is a good question. There is a National Commission for Water, and that commission actually is in charge of making these large infrastructure investments and making sure that aquifers are protected. So that exists. And in addition to that, there's also a local water commission that is in charge of procuring water quality in Mexico City. So these type of agencies are in place. I guess that the question is, from a policy perspective, whether we can change these macroeconomic trends in water consumption, right? So as I said, the expansion of urban settlements places tremendous pressure on aquifers because it prevents them from recharging. Mm-hmm. There's more pavement, there's more people, consumption of water is higher, and pollution increases. And so it's not very clear that a commission by itself can mitigate these trends as these pertain to aggregate behavior. And one way of thinking about this is precisely the awareness point that you made earlier, Mike. Raising awareness is actually crucial in this respect, because we want a sort of aggregate awareness that, or a macro level awareness that water usage should be reduced. And so I'm not sure that the way to think about this is by looking at authorities only. So these authorities cannot solve everything or every single problem.
And I think if we've learned anything in this past hour, it's the complexity of the problem, right? That it really is we all need to contribute and promote responses to the water challenge here in Mexico City and around the world. We're coming up on an hour, so I want to take this opportunity to thank you, Alejandro. Thank you for a fascinating conversation that I've thoroughly enjoyed, but also to thank you for what I can only describe as incredibly important work that you're doing, both here in Mexico and around the world. So thank you for both of those things. I also want to thank the audience for joining us today. I hope that you've enjoyed the conversation as much as I have. In addition, I want to let everyone know that next week we'll be traveling to the London Global Gateway, where we will discuss the sustainability of rivers in London. There are already short explainer videos by lecturer Faye Stevens available on the ThinkND website. Please review those and come prepared next week to join us. I'd also invite our guests to share this series with your friends. We are accepting registrations throughout the entire program, as each meeting can stand alone. I think you've seen that today. Thank you again. Thank you, Alejandro. Thank you to the audience. Thank you to all of those who participated and contributed to making today happen. And I hope all of you enjoy the rest of your day. Take care.
Thank you so much.